Welcome to the Phil Lewis podcast. I'm Phil Lewis. Here we are in episode 3, and I just want to start by saying a big thank you for all of the questions, comments and reflections we've received to the 2 episodes we've pushed out into the world so far. It's been really good to see this little experiment in podcasting already start having an impact in our corner of the world. So thank you for that, and hope you keep listening as the episodes roll by. To which point, for episode 3, I am joined by a wonderful human, Liz Robinson of the educational organisation Big Education. Liz has an interesting and moving story for us about what it means to have to execute a decision that you simply do not agree with, and how you bear the consequences of that, and what you can learn from it as a leader. In the second half then, I'm joined by another coach and consultant, Hasan Khair, who is going to help me make sense of that story and look at some of the broader leadership lessons from it. But for now, let's get into my conversation with Liz. Liz, lovely to see you.
Pleasure to be with you, Phil.
Where does this podcast find you?
I'm in a school in North London.
I'm talking to you from Brighton this morning. I've had a ridiculously early flight to get down here, and I'm down here for some work and business related stuff. But yes, I'm in a podcast recording studio in Brighton. Anyway, my day is livened by seeing you, so that's all to the good. Liz, give us a sense of kind of background and context, and you're a CEO and a head teacher of some considerable standing. It'd be good just to get a couple of minutes on career background and how you've ended up where you've ended up.
So now I run a multi-academy trust. So for people who are not in the geeky education world, that's a group of state schools that are run in a sort of quasi-independent way. So still subject to Ofsted and the expectations of the government, but with a bit more independence than local authority schools. Having been a head teacher for 13 years before that, before I set the trust up. So how did that all come about? Yeah, I was very motivated to work with children and young people. Both my parents were social workers, so they said, do anything in the world but don't become a social worker. And when I left university, went to LSE, did philosophy, did very well. And I always say most people turned left out of LSE, which is just at the edge of the city, turned left into the city and went into sort of finance related work. And I turned right and went and taught in a really tricky school up on the Edgware Road in North London. And yeah, so I was drawn to work in the communities that needed the most help. And initially that was through teaching, and then very quickly realised or saw that for me, leading a school was the way that you could really make profound difference to that school, but actually to the whole community. So schools as the hubs of engagement in the hubs of services in communities is really where my passion is, and leadership as a critical component within that. So many interventions in schools and communities that work or don't work. But when you track back to what makes the difference, it's almost always about the quality of the leadership and how things are done, and making wise decisions about what we do and don't do. So that's really become my big passion, is supporting, developing leaders in the system and thinking about what leadership is needed in these increasingly complex times.
I am entirely sure that if you spent the time that you have as a head teacher and the time that you have also as a CEO of a trust, that there's no shortage of really interesting examples of challenges and problems and obstacles that you've faced over the years. But is there one particularly tough or challenging time that stands out to you that we could spend some time talking about and thinking through together today?
Yeah. Yes, there is. Yeah. Because this is, I suppose, an example of kind of local and national politics, which, yeah, so this was to do with the founding of a new school. So I was involved in setting up a new school, which was under the Free Schools programme, which was, again, a government-funded initiative, but which involved, it was essentially a mechanism for opening new schools and an opportunity for innovation in the system. And I was very attracted to that because I'm interested in innovative practices in schools. And so that was a way of doing that. So got involved with this parent-led initiative to start a new school, which was in Greenwich. And it was a secondary school focused around the IB. So I think the IB is a brilliant a brilliant kind of program of study, and obviously has that international context and a breadth to it that goes beyond the kind of narrow academic core.
Just define IB for us, if you would. Is that the International
so
Baccalaureate?
the IB, the International Baccalaureate. Yeah. So I guess what was challenging about that, so there's sort of different layers, I suppose. This was essentially a Tory party policy, and naturally I would sit not hugely aligned with many of the Tory policies. Always been a kind of lifelong Labour voter, but this was an initiative that came through the sort of more free market, neoliberal sort of ideology of let's let things flourish and let the kind of market decide. So in a sense, coming from a position of not particularly on my politics, but it was being opportunistic to say this is a way we could start a new school. And so I guess there was kind of a bit of compromise as I'm telling that story from the beginning about how that fitted with my personal politics, as well as being pragmatic in the system and taking those kind of opportunities. And it was a really wonderful project in so many ways. So many people got engaged with it. There was such a kind of desire for this school in the local community, got huge kind of engagement, and the school opened. To cut a very long story short, we applied to the Department for Education, were successful in getting the school opened. And I mean, so essentially what then happened, the school was opened and the Department for Education were responsible for finding you a building. Now, we opened in temporary accommodation with the promise of this building, beautiful architectural drawings of which, we saw over many, many iterations. And as with many big governmental projects, there were delays and delays and delays. So we're in this temporary building. And eventually the planning permission, the site that they'd identified for us, the planning permission was refused. And after various fairly traumatic months and weeks of figuring out what that meant, the minister took the final decision that we were going to close the school. So at that point, we had 350 students who'd, with their families, given us their confidence that we were, going to get this building and that we were developing this very special, unique school. And I got the news, and I always remember the moment. It was my daughter's birthday. My older daughter, her birthday's on Halloween, and I just remember this particular day when she was about 7, I think, and I'd done the whole mummy thing in the morning of opening her presents and all that jazz, and then had got called into the department to meet the minister, and he told me that they'd taken the decision that we were going to have to close the school, and that we were going to have to tell everybody the next day that was what was happening, because we were about to go into purdah in a period of before the general election, when no decisions can be made. So that night I got back, and obviously my daughter's birthday, it's Halloween. I was taking her trick-or-treating, and so I had this kind of emergency meeting with my board and senior team. And said, right, I'll meet you at 8 o'clock because I've got to go trick-or-treating, because it's my daughter's birthday. I can't not do that. And so we sort of spent the night from 8 o'clock onwards writing the comms and planning how we were going to go the next day to tell, first of all, the head teacher that we were going to have to close the school, head teacher, all the teachers that were about to be made redundant, and then tell the 350 students and their families that the school was going to close. And as an example of, it was so challenging. And I guess the themes around what's in your control and what's not in your control, because I was having to front it. I was responsible and accountable in the eyes of the stakeholders, the parents, and the pupils and the staff. But I didn't have the power to make the decisions about the things that got in the way of that project flourishing. So it was ghastly. That's not a word you say every day, but it was.
It sounds it. You and I have known each other for quite a while. And for our listeners who aren't, I don't profess to be an expert in this, but for our listeners who aren't immersed in the world of education, you say we opened a school, and of course itself, that is a colossal amount of work, a huge commitment, huge money, lots and lots of effort and endeavour over years, usually, even to get to the point. And then to be in a situation where you then have to effectively wind that thing up before it's even had really a chance that it's got off the ground, because you've got 350 students, but not got off the ground in terms of its promise and the fulfillment of its mission and all those sorts of things. By the sounds of it, over what was little more than a kind of planning problem. So there's a couple of things I'm interested to kind of dive into here. So we'll talk about, I'd love to talk with you about the challenges of the communications and how you handled all of that. But just before we get to that, I'm also curious as to how it felt for you going into that, because, again, I know you and I know the passion and commitment that you tend to bring to your work, and I know the kind of people who you tend to favour working with as well. And so I'm curious to understand, was it sudden? Was it not sudden? How did it feel to be kind of going through that, and what was going on with the team and what was going on for you?
Yeah, I mean, it was, as I'm talking about it, I was just sort of thinking, actually, I was noticing the emotion, sort of tapping back into it. And I think there's a lot of talk about sort of PTSD, but it was traumatic. It was really traumatic. And I can feel that coming back as it's not really funny, I know I'm laughing, but coming back as I'm really take myself back through that journey. Yes, and as I say, sort of skipping through, and we open the school, it's like, the hundreds of hours of my life and everybody else's lives involved it's almost too painful to think about. And as you say, when it, the lack of any sort of sense of justice or even kind of rational understanding of how that could be that happened. And when you think about the taxpayers' money that was spent on, not by me, but by central government through all that planning process. I mean, they're just hundreds of hours of professional fees of architects and planning consultants and, all of that stuff. It's sort of grotesque, but and it's really about politics, because that was really what it came down to, was politics. It was a national government Tory policy butting up against a left-wing Labour local council in Greenwich. You didn't want it, and they blocked it. So that's, yeah. So what did it feel like? That was your question. I'm obviously avoiding you answering it. I think when I look back on it, and I also had young kids at the time. Both my daughters were little, and there's a kind of pervading sense of kind of tightness in my chest and anxiety, it was like watching a train going, the track going off the end of the table, and just sort of in slow motion watching this thing heading towards the cliff, and doing, sort of chucking all sorts of things, trying to change the trajectory of where this was going, but not having any of the levers to redirect the train or, build more track or whatever you want to do with that
because these
metaphor.
Decisions are being taken way out of your hands here, aren't they, ultimately?
Totally. The decisions were out of the hands, but it was, I'm bright and I'm quick, and I could see where it was going. And I guess one of the things I look back on, so there was a kind of, in answer to your question, there was a sort of tightening of the noose of the anxiety of like, constricting, of just seeing where this was going and desperately trying to reach out. And I've got lots of connections, trying to get like, somebody help us here, but really not, don't know that there was anything to be done. It was like it was set on this track. So it was a horrible feeling of being, with sort of the public face and getting the grief and dealing with incredibly angry, understandably angry parents, but like really people can behave in such a, really very, very challenging way. Some of it was very abusive, and we had to get the police involved, with the amount of abuse I was taking personally as the front person. And so there was this sort of constricting thing. And then, this is now whatever it is, five years ago since the closure happened. Maybe it's even 6 years, lose track of time. And I have worked extremely hard to get to a point of kind of completion about it.
There's something about there's a lot of themes of responsibility in all this, aren't there, actually? Because, of course, there's these decisions being taken about the future of this school and millions of pounds of taxpayers' money and everything else. And you've got the Tory government wanting one thing, a local council wanting another. And ultimately, the responsibility for the decisions rests with them. But the responsibility for the enactment of those decisions rests with you and your team. And the responsibility to deal with the emotional consequences of those decisions, we can have the debate, the discussion about where that should sit, but ultimately it feels like
it was no question where in reality.
You've taken that on as well. So there's, I think, any leader listening to this who is, there's a lot of leaders I deal with wrestle with a reality which is they're required by virtue of their role to enact decisions that they don't agree with in any way, shape or form, and really can't say anything about that a lot of the time, and just have to kind of get on and try and find a way to do it. There's some stuff in there about the nature of responsibility. Where does it sit, and what your own relationship? And it sounds like you've worked that through well over time, but that strikes me as being right at the heart of this story, really.
I've definitely kind of been on a journey around being more discerning about that, about, okay, well, how does that relate to my life and what I want? So I guess two sort of bits of wisdom that fell out of that. One is my mum, who says to me, just because you can doesn't mean you have to, which I think is a really powerful message, and it's really been really important for me. And the other thing is my made-up proverb. That's a Liz Robinson original, which is that, if you bend over backwards all the time, all that happens is you get a bad back. Now, it's a bit silly, but it's also quite profound, but which is about, of course, holding your boundaries.
It strikes me as a good proverb. Yeah, it strikes me as a really good proverb. I want to go back to the team for a sec, because, again, I'm interested in how you led them. So I'd love to just talk to you about that for a second. So thinking about that time when you've had let's just say the horrible news handed to you, school's got to close, you have a responsibility. They've got a team of people who need to go and enact that. You've got very, very unhappy parents by the sounds of it, and we should talk more. I want to talk more about the comms stuff as well momentarily, but you've got very, very unhappy parents as well. And there's a lot of flack then coming in, but you're the figurehead of that, that particular initiative. So what was the approach that you took to leading that group of people, teachers, staff, presumably other directors, like whatever else you had around you? How did you address that?
Yeah, I mean, we did have a great comms person. I mean, that without being flippant about it.
Help.
So that who is an external consultant who, found the right person. But I think that's a non-trivial piece, especially and maybe it's different in the kind of corporate world, but in certainly in education, and especially coming from a primary school background, you come from a small team, generally speaking, of a sort of in terms of the corporate running of the institution. There's usually a few of you who are not specialists, and so as a primary head, you're a generalist because you are back. You have an HR lead and you probably have a bursar or someone who's doing the finances, but usually not at a particularly sophisticated level. So you haven't got a lawyer, or you're used to being across a whole bunch of stuff as a generalist, as hopefully a skillful generalist. And actually that has been a big learning for me going into working at a bigger scale, which is knowing the edges of that. That's useful to be a competent all-rounder, but actually comms is a profession. And there are people who do that shit, as their whole job, and are really good at it. So knowing when to get specialist help on things as a competent all-rounder, I think, is a really important thing to notice. And it's not a sign of failure, and it's not that you couldn't do a reasonably good job yourself. But it's like, so that was really important. And I think, ultimately, I don't think there's any sort of rocket science to it, but I think it was really about being candid as well as being kind, making space for the emotional reactions from people was critical, and expecting that and allowing that and being able to handle that. I'm thinking about that next morning, the 1st of November, when I walked into the school building like the angel of death, first meeting with the head teacher at 7 a.m. or whatever. It's like, yeah, the decision's been made, the school's going to close. Yeah, and that does mean you're about to be made redundant. It's like there's no dodging it. But I think clarity and then kindness and space for the emotion and showing, being showing up for that was really important. And I think there was, on me as the figurehead of it, I had to be there. So that, we had a parent meeting, the following day or week or whenever it was, and it was literally like one of the most terrifying things I've ever had to do, with 300 plus more in a room and
Take
having
us
to be the
inside
one.
that meeting. So tell us what that was like.
Yeah, it's probably what you might imagine, which was a big room full of lots of very pissed off people in a really visceral way. And I think, you can have an angry customer, who's like, I'm really annoyed because my broadband didn't get fixed when you said, or whatever. But like, these are their kids and this is their education.
You've
And
got
like,
300, that's different. Angry customer is different to 300 seriously pissed off people whose children's futures have just been affected by a decision.
Has just been disrupted.
In a room when you
and
yourself...
you're the only person whose face they know who's
totally.
the front of this.
That must have been a hell of a day at the office, Liz. It must have been.
Yeah, it was really, really, it's interesting to look back on it because I haven't thought about this stuff for quite a long time. I've sort of left it sedentary, but it was extreme. It's an extreme situation to find oneself in.
You're doing all that work then to create space for others. You're doing all of that work with the board. You're doing all that work with the parents as well. And you mentioned the communications and everything else. How did you cope?
It did have an impact on me. So that I did cope, I think, but it took more of me than I could deal with. In truth, my previous capacity to override, the sense of actually this doesn't feel right or it's too much. It's like, oh no, I can do it. So it'd always be overriding, going into the red on the speedometer. So it's like, okay, actually interrupt that. Give myself some choice. I don't have to do that. Make a choice, so that sort of attunement has been really important. The truth is that, some period after the school actually closed, once it was all kind of the main bit of the risk had all been managed, then I had a breakdown, but I was then signed off work for a month, with work-related stress and sort of stopped functioning. And I was in a coaching session with my lovely coach at the time. And she basically made an intervention, said, I'm not going to let you leave here until you've rung the doctors. Because, and I'm grateful to her for that. But I was so close to it that I couldn't see that I wasn't okay. And so that was, and I, for somebody who'd been achieving very highly, blah, 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 into coaching, into self, for me to hit that point where I was actually signed off and feel that I just couldn't do it anymore was very shocking in itself, but did act as a catalyst for me into really going to another level of self-development work and self-awareness in terms of quite how I'd got myself into that whole situation. And I'm really proud of it. And it's interesting to tell the story to you about that because I had so much positive feedback that kind of in a completely and utterly shit situation, I did lead us all through that sort of as well as anyone could have hoped that we did. And we did close the school in a best possible way. And we stayed open for the kids who were going into their GCSEs so that they could, finish their GCSEs, and they did really brilliantly. And like we did as best as we possibly could in the circumstances. And I'm proud of that.
You, by the sounds of it, led that very, very well. But there was a cost to that. And the interesting thing, just listening to you reflect, and we'll finish up with this, but interesting listening to you reflect is that cost of that in a sense is also borne by the organisation as well, isn't it? Because actually, you then have to pause, take a few weeks off, recalibrate, go again, as a leader. And so actually it sounds like all of the work that you've done since on reflecting, personal development, everything else, only resources you not only to handle such situations better in the future, but actually handle them in a way which will pay forward to your organization even better in the future, through avoidance of burnout, all that sort of stuff as well. Leaders who burn out serving their organizations, it doesn't serve the organization as well as it doesn't serve them. But as we often say on this podcast, you weren't born experienced. Do you know what I mean? You have to learn as you go. Liz, I just want to say thank you for sharing that with us. I mean, as a story, I mean, it's horrifying for lots and lots of reasons that you've touched on, to do with taxpayers' money, to do with children's futures, to do with the amount of effort and energy that people like you put into initiatives making work. These are not in rank order in any way, shape or form, but also horrifying at the level of just the emotional consequences for sort of everybody involved, the practical consequences for everybody involved. But, there are huge parallels, I think, in this story for anybody who's going through any kind of huge organizational change, where the leader themselves may not actually fully be in supportive of the decision. And in some cases actually be horrified by the decision, but still required to enact it, and be really on the sharp end of all the reactions to that decision as well. So there's some really valuable insights in that. And just from a personal perspective as well, a tremendous story as well as of just recovery after what was clearly a really difficult time, and lessons learned in a healthy way from a really difficult time as well. So thank you for coming on the podcast, and thank you for all you've shared.
It's a pleasure, Phil. Just before we go, I just want to say it's probably unlikely that anyone directly involved in the school listens to this, but there may well be. So there may be, who knows? But I suppose I just suddenly thought that, of gosh, I wonder what this would sound like to one of those parents, or, of course, they're all still around and about. So, yeah, I suppose I just wanted to acknowledge that it had an impact on me, and it did impact on all those people, staff, pupils and families. And that is what happened, and we all did our best. But I just wanted to sort of acknowledge that, really, that that it did have an impact, and hopefully, I know there's lots of positives that have come from it. But it was a very difficult thing.
That is what happened. Is sometimes one of the hardest phrases, isn't it? That is what happened.
It is.
Liz, thank you for everything you shared. Where can we find you now? Where can we find out more about your work?
So I'm at Big Education, which is bigeducation.org, and we are doing fantastic work. We're working in the system. So we run 3 schools in London which model and exemplify our approach to education. A big, fat, juicy, enriched, meaningful, purposeful education, not a narrow, desiccated one. That's what we're aiming for. But we run a load of different projects and programmes which are working on the system. So in the system, but also trying to work on the system to bring about change. So feeling optimistic, lots of different areas, particularly around leadership, around enrichment in schools, around assessment. We're working with government and working with lots of schools around the country to try and make it better.
And having seen close up the work of Big Education, anybody who's remotely interested in education should go and check it out. But it really is quite remarkable, some of the impact that initiative is having on not only the lives of children, but the lives of family and the lives of communities as well. So, it's good stuff. In the second half of this episode, I am joined by Hasan Khair. Has and I have known each other for years, and I've always been struck by the depth of compassion for and insight that he has around leaders and what leadership means. And so I thought he would be perfect to invite on so we could reflect together on some of the themes emerging from that conversation with Liz. Has, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Where does this podcast find you?
I'm in Brighton. I moved here from London in 2016. It is home now. I love it. Even in the elemental weather, it is a perfect place to be.
Well, Brighton, even elemental Brighton's quite different to, say, elemental Scotland, which is where I'm talking to you from. You and I are doing a sort of slightly Land's End, John O'Groats recording this morning, aren't we? Good to see you. So let's talk about the story you just heard in part 1 of this podcast. Where I find myself inclined to go, just to start us off, I mean, I found that a really interesting, challenging, and inspiring listen through the lens of, there are specifics in the story, of course, but through the lens of actually, this was a human being who was ultimately on the front end as a leader of having to execute a decision that she profoundly disagreed with, and then having to also be on the front end of all of the negative feedback and the consequences of that, and all the receiving end of all that kind of opprobrium and everything else. And I found myself thinking back over the years how many times I've seen leaders in different sorts of organizations faced with dilemmas like that. I don't know if that stood out to you too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you find yourself in corporate life these days, there is an inevitability that there will be things that are happening outside of your control, decisions that are taken outside of your control. And often, if you're representing a division or a large team or a team of any size, actually, and that you're going to have to communicate decisions that you don't necessarily believe in. There's so much at stake because it isn't just about values at this point. It's about, you're considering your livelihood, you're considering the impact of others. I think some organizations and some leaders understand that even when you have to communicate difficult things, you do it with humanity and empathy, which is clearly what Liz did. Others don't quite get that. They just basically take the edict from above and deliver it in a way that is efficient and moves the organization forward. But there's obviously a massive cost and an impact of doing it in that way. So it really struck me that even though it was such a short time frame that Liz had, she was able to gather herself and kind of deliver it with the most humanity and empathy and care that she could.
Yeah, we can talk about the cost of that, I think, in a moment, but it's a point worth making, isn't it? That the humanity and empathy in those sorts of situations, I mean, that is emotional labor. In that case, she was really thinking about how the parents were likely to feel, how the teachers and people in the school were likely to feel, and so on. And then trying to connect to that and trying to meet people in that. And there is an investment to doing that. There's a cost to doing that, if we want to put it in those terms. And so there's that real tension, isn't there, in this story about you're putting all of that in, that investment in empathy, that investment in care, in a situation where actually at the same time you're in profound disagreement with the decision, and holding that tension, I think, is really at the heart of the story, and actually really at the heart of the leadership challenge of this story as well.
Yeah, I think I was reflecting on this after listening, that working in education, you have to really be able to balance the need to do the high care and high control. You need to be able to handle a lot of the operational detail, but you also have to care about people. And that balance is often hard to do intuitively. And in a situation where you are faced with having to deliver news that is going to impact not just the 350 children, but all of their families, the compounding effect, I think you have to make the decision to lean into the right thing to do versus anything else. I mean, that's my assumption in how Liz took the decision on that evening before she had to go and start delivering that news to people.
It's interesting, isn't it, that because you may disagree with the decision, but there's a kind of act of service going on there as well. The leadership choice in that moment is, okay, I don't like this, but how can I be of service, of greatest service to these people in this moment? And how I can be of greatest service to these people in this moment is actually in being as empathic as I possibly can and showing up in the most fulsome way that I know how to do. And actually, ultimately, in being prepared to take the negative feedback, the abuse, the whatever else kind of comes with that, because I understand that it's not personal, and that actually is just something that these people will need to work through because they're being let down. And I think you're right. I think it comes from that place of care, doesn't it? It comes from that place of, okay, I don't like this, but the best thing I can do is look after these people, and the best way I can look after these people in this situation is to be as warm and empathic as I can. And again, you just contrast that with the behavior of other leaders in other environments, where actually the withholding of that humanity and the withholding of that empathy can be a self-protection mechanism as much as anything else, can't it? It can be that thing of, actually, I don't agree with this, but also I need to make sure that my reputation is not being damaged by this. I need to make sure that my standing isn't being compromised in some way, shape, or form. And actually, for whatever reason, I'm not really willing to do that work. So it's a striking example of what you're saying of almost like, what's the least worst thing I can do? And the least worst thing I can do is show care, you know?
Even if you disagree with a situation, thinking about what your audience needs to hear has to be an important part of your decision-making criteria, because actually, whilst it may be easy for one to kind of blame other people for making the decision, the impact on that mass of people who are receiving the news could be really significant. So it's really about how you show up as a leader in that moment. And it's not always the easiest decision, because sometimes it's the how to do it that gets murky and cloudy and difficult. And that's what drives the decision-making process. So we always try and help people to figure out how to make the right decision first, and then the how, you know, and then you deal with the how in its respective parts.
That decision to take ownership over something, that decision to not blame others, puts the leader in a really innately lonely place. And one of the things that gives rise to loneliness, I believe, a lot of the time, is the fact that there's a kind of asymmetry of information. So in that particular circumstance, there's been a whole set of things that are outside your control. There's been a whole set of, you know, issues that only you are privy to. And the people that you're there to talk to have no insight into. And at some level, it may not even serve them to know about, because it's not actually going to make the pain of whatever sort go away. But the fact that you're there enacting a decision over which you as a leader had no control whatsoever, there's all these other factors that are influencing it.
I would add another piece to that, which is, if we're talking about leaders, then there's also the lens or the spectrum of high performance that gets baked in. And there is guilt and shame around not performing, and therefore people aren't willing to be vulnerable even amongst their peers, because there's a standing that they want to continue to kind of show up with. And so where people would really benefit from talking to each other and sharing their vulnerabilities, often I find that people don't. And so when I have coaching conversations with leaders, often it's just like, oh, I just need a space where I can just let it all out.
There is no leader out there, I believe, who is doing any sort of leadership work who is not experiencing some degree of loneliness. And yet we're not normalizing conversations around that a lot of the time. And we're not normalizing getting in touch for help, someone to talk to. And we need to start normalizing the process of asking for help, and actually understanding that if we are acknowledging this very human predicament that we are in, which is the predicament of loneliness, the predicament of sadness, or whatever it is, that there is nothing innately, we're not failing, we're just having a human experience, you know? And actually it strengthens us as leaders. It doesn't compromise us as leaders to be able to have those sorts of conversations.
Yeah, I agree. You say we need to normalize. I'm curious about how we do it. You know, I spend a lot of time studying managers, and it said that the span of control has gone from one manager being responsible for 5 people in 2017 to one manager being responsible for 15 today, and the numbers are only getting worse. So the concern for leaders is time, you know, and making time. And if it doesn't, unless you're at your lowest ebb, and that's often when people are in crises and then go and seek out help. But that isn't always the best place to do the work from. How do we get people to not look at it like it's a vitamin, you know, that you take one day, you know, when you're feeling actually okay, and get them to recognize how important it is as part of their portfolio of things that they can rely on as part of their leadership journey. I'm not
I had
sure.
a really challenging conversation with someone a week or two ago, actually, and I was in this conversation talking about doing quite a lot of keynote speaking or workshops at the moment, but really helping leaders to look at the consequences of historic negative experience in their organizations and unresolved conflict in their organizations and everything else. And one of the challenges that this particular individual I was having lunch, she's lovely and she's being very supportive, but she was like, Phil, a really central problem of your business is that everybody else is selling paracetamol and you're selling a 6-week rehab program. and actually, fundamentally, the world wants paracetamol. It doesn't want the 6-week rehab program effectively. Or she's saying you're a much more niche kind of proposition in the work that you do. And I found that sort of simultaneously quite amusing as an analogy, quite opposite as an analogy, but also quite challenging as an analogy without getting into the sort of business end of it from my perspective. But it is interesting, isn't it? It's like the work of leadership, the real emotional work of leadership, I believe, is being able to deal with those feelings and also engaging the help that sometimes is needed to deal with those feelings and to deal with that, to deal with the shadow sides of our own behavior, which I think also takes us to another theme of the conversation. I was curious to see what sense you made of this, but one of the things that also came through, while there was a real strength in leadership there in terms of taking ownership, demonstrating empathy, demonstrating care, one of the things that Liz also pointed out very clearly in that conversation, and this relates to the personal toll that it took on her, was the people-pleasing, bending over backwards element of it as well. And she had that lovely phrase, if you keep bending over backwards, you don't get very much except for a sore back. And so there's a shadow at work there, isn't there, in all of this too, which is on the one hand, I'm trying to do the right thing by these people and demonstrate care and empathy and everything else. The slight shadow of that is the people pleasing, do what is necessary to be liked perhaps in those moments as well. And I just wondered what you made of that, because it really stood out to me. And actually, will also tell you, by the way, resonated with me very deeply at a personal level, because I have a people pleaser and a conflict averse kid and teenager inside of me who's very active a lot of the time.
Yeah. And I think people pleasing isn't. I don't think it's just about being liked. It's about if it's a value to be of service, and so it is also just about wanting to kind of always be delivering for other people, like it's part of your value system, and I actually think one of the earliest tests in leadership is around people pleasing, is when you're first promoted into a first-time manager role. And it's when you have to go from being a mate to a boss. And I get asked about this often. I think it is relevant because unless you set your boundaries early and consistently and you communicate them, you will continually add more. And it will compound. And unless you're really sort of structured in the early days, it can become debilitative for you, in later leadership life. But going from being a boss to from a friend to a boss requires contracting. It requires being communicative around the change. It's about enrolling your friends in your new journey. And if they don't buy in, then they're not your friends. So then you need to start thinking, well, why am I people pleasing these people if they don't care about me? So whilst I'm using that as an example in the early stages of your career, you can apply those at a later stage. So when I first took a real leap in my corporate career, I went into a large advertising network, and I was a regional director of HR for that advertising network. And I saw a lot of assimilation around the alpha character who was the CEO in the boardroom, and I just thought, I can't be fucked with that. That's not me. I'm going to do things my way. And so what I decided to do was just be the same consistent leader with everybody. And so I would never get caught in saying two things to different people.
I remember years ago saying to my therapist about boundaries. I really, really hate having to impose these boundaries, right? And he said to me, Phil, everybody hates having to impose boundaries. Just some of us are better at it than others.
Yeah.
And I found that kind of quite liberating at the time, because I was like, oh, okay, there's the normalizing of a very kind of human thing there. The other thing is really interesting about, I love your story, by the way, about consistency, because the consistency of and not really getting enmeshed in all that political stuff, I think, is a real skill in corporate life. But I was also thinking about this phrase, people pleasing, which is an interesting phrase in a way, because it's now, I think, become wholly associated or largely associated with a very negative set of behaviors, about boundary-free behaviors, about, doing what's necessary to be liked, or to your point, not necessarily always about being liked, but to serve and all of that kind of stuff. But actually, at some level, we all have to exist in relationship with one another, right? So there is always, with these things, there is the light side and the shadow side. And one of the decisions that all of us need to make, wherever we are in our career, and you are bang on, by the way, that it needs to be early on in the career, I think, is that we have to make choices about how we are going to navigate through that world. We have to make choices about how we build a reputation for ourselves. We have to make choices about what we are prepared to give and where we draw some lines. And what's really interesting about Liz's story, I think, is that sense of it pushed her and it pushed her and it pushed her, and then she felt the need to go back and redraw those boundaries for herself. She felt the need to recalibrate, and there's something about the permissioning to do that wherever you are in your career that is immensely valuable, I believe.
Yeah. I think agency came up for me quite a lot when I was listening to Liz's story. How much agency do I have? How much control do I have? What really struck me was, clearly Liz was an incredibly highly competent, high performer in her previous life as a primary head, and then sort of bringing an academy to bear. Even you noted it takes an incredible amount of effort and time and energy and resource and emotion and all those sorts of things. And one has agency to a point in any situation. I often talk about control the controllables, and so much of our energy goes towards things that we can't control. So much of the energy goes to things that matter, and then loads goes to things that don't matter. So if you can find that sweet spot of putting your energy on the things that you can control across the things that can matter, and that little intersection of those two is where I would spend most of my time if I could. We have agency to a point, and then we don't have agency. And there's a lot of pressure on society at the moment to show up in a particular way. Work is much more competitive. The economy is much more impactful than it has been for a lot of people in the workforce today. It's hard to scrape by for a lot of people. So you don't necessarily have the agency to not people please or not operate in a certain way because you fear for your livelihood.
Well, there's room for a lot of compassion in that, isn't there, as well? Because, as I'm very fond of talking about in my in my writing, it's a cold and different world out there, and we all have to, do what we need to do or we think we need to do to try and survive. And your point's really well made. I mean, again, it's the conversations about boundaries and self-care and all of those things are often very well intentioned, but they can be a bit glib, because actually what can happen is they can ignore the very real lived reality of the kind of things you were just talking about as well, that we are in a world where, even if you take AI, right? I mean, there is so much worry in the world of work about the world of AI at the moment. That actually what we're seeing people left, right, and centre going, hang on a second, am I still going to have a job here in 3 years, 5 years? What will it look like? And in some industries, that threat is incredibly real. So there is always a conversation around all of this, around one, how do you look after yourself? 2, I know this is very dear to you, Has, as well. How do you play from your strengths in terms of how you show up in work? And 3, how do you make sure that actually you are bringing the best value of which you are capable within that boundary time that you set out? And that feels like a really healthy discussion, not only at the leader level, but at the manager level in a lot of organizations as well, I believe.
Yeah, I wholly agree with everything that you said, and it was where I was going to take the conversation. You can't win if you're just trying to not be offensive, right? Like you can't win if you're just basically going to just do enough, because more and more will be expected up to a point where you can't give any more. You can't give more hours. You can't give more acquiescence. You can't give any more. And then you'll just be measured against either somebody who is, or some sort of technology that's able to do everything that you are now doing, right? And I think leaning in with what energizes you, playing to your strengths, as you mentioned, is something that's very dear to me, is something that I've spent a decade trying to kind of help leaders to find. And when I talk about strengths, or when one talks about strengths, it's about the things that energize us and we can correlate to our performance. So rather than just thinking about what I'm not good at, think about what I'm great at, and let me lean into that, and let me enjoy my work, and let me enjoy bringing my kind of authentic value set and my authentic perspective into the space. Sometimes there's risk, oftentimes there's reward, but I think it's really important as we emerge into this kind of new workforce state that we're really clear on who we are at an individual level and who we are collectively, and we lean into that. I genuinely believe that community is going to be incredibly important in all facets of life, but particularly in the workplace in the next few years.
100%. The other point that this kind of gets to, I think, is one of the things that the conversation with Liz touched on right at the end, which was around actually when does self-sacrifice start to actually become counterproductive as well. One of the things I found myself, as I was talking with her, contemplating was whether or not actually a leader who is going beyond with some very good intentions, but as Liz herself pointed out, going above and beyond all the time in what she's doing, and actually, as she says herself, bending over backwards, left, right, and centre. But then in the end, as we see this happen a lot, burns out as a result of it, needs to take some time out. Actually, in the end, there's something there about not actually being of maximal service to the organisation. That's not to sound in any respect critical, and I talked about this with Liz at the time, of course, but it is that thing of, if we look after ourselves, we are better resourced to be able to look after our organizations. If we don't look after ourselves, if we don't have boundaries, if we don't take care of that stuff, then in the end, actually, we're compromising the health and well-being of the whole. When I don't know why this comes up for me now, but I'm going to share it anyway. Years ago, I don't really watch telly, but years ago, I remember watching. It was brilliant. This an episode of Casualty, or it could have been Holby City, right, in the early days. Right,
very different, very different.
But anyway, this is where we're going to go. So we're going to go with it. And there was a heart surgeon, and he was sort of fabulously rude guy, in this particular drama. And he'd been told he'd had a day off from surgery, and there was a patient who was going to die if he didn't go in and do that surgery. And the whole episode was about his refusal to do it, his absolute refusal to do it. Now, in the end, what was interesting is he kind of caved to the pressure. But his point throughout the whole thing was, if I do this, there is a danger that every other surgery I will perform for the next 3 weeks or whatever it is going to be compromised because I have not had time to rest. And that was up against the emotionality of a patient who is actually in really quite serious trouble, of course, in the context of that drama. And that ethical dilemma, I think, is so interesting. It's like, where does it serve the organization, the medium to longer term, to to draw some genuine boundaries around what you're prepared to give and not give. So as a working coach and consultant, one of the things that I've had to learn over the years is if I don't have time to rest between meetings to reflect on what we've talked about, I do not serve my clients in the most full way that I am able to. And I think they deserve the best that I'm able to give. And if I can't give that, then I have to look at my own behavior in that context.
Just to go back to strengths, strengths are strengths until they're not. And what I mean by that is they can tip into overdrive. You do it, you apply that strength too much in the wrong place at the wrong time, and it leads to an unintended consequence. So resilience is a perfect example. I'm resilient up until the point where the resilience is now starting to burn your energy because you're just showing up, no matter what. And actually that isn't what it should be. Resilience is about stepping away, knowing when to step away. It's about being able to make clear decisions, the right decisions. It's not just about showing up all the time. Empathy and compassion, two narratives I heard quite a lot in the story. They can easily, I have both empathy and compassion as strengths of my own. I know what it feels like when they tip into overdrive. You want to care for all those people around you, but then you end up taking it home. So I can imagine, I think, it wasn't just about the event. I think it was probably building for weeks, if not months before, the compounded empathy that you were taking home about, well, what happens if this school closes? What happens to those kids? What happens to those families? And if we think about it in a leadership sense, I've sadly, as an ex-HR director, I had to do lots of restructures, and it would sit with me for weeks before, and it would sit with me long after. Now, I would always do it in the most humane way possible, and often I would agree it was the right business decision to do those restructures, but it would still weigh heavily on me. You have to put your own oxygen mask on first as a leader. And, I think too often what we try and do is put oxygen mask onto other people, look after our teams, look after our families, look after our mates. But in order to be available to everyone, you need to make sure that you're not in the red.
Quite right. And that brings us to the end of this conversation. And part of our role in our job here, Has, is to try and ultimately land what has been quite a wide-ranging conversation and a couple of insights that our audience can hopefully take away. I'll tell you what stays with me as a result of the reflections that you and I have been engaged in over the course of this conversation. I mean, firstly, I found myself, again, curious about loneliness, the loneliness of leadership, and the work that needs to be done to normalize that and to encourage leaders to pay attention to that. I also was really, I found your point around actually the idea of the demonstration of empathy as almost a radical act of care as a leader in even the worst situations, I think is a really, really healthy challenge actually for leaders to think through how they are showing up in those moments and what's the real work that needs to be done. I think it's really honours Liz, actually, that element of the story too. And then also just where we were at the end there, just thinking about the deep thinking that leaders really do need to do about boundaries. It's not an easy question, this. Enforcement around boundaries isn't easy, but also how do I navigate and how do I help my people through a process of negotiating and setting boundaries with themselves and negotiating and setting boundaries with others around them. There's some really deep thinking work to be done there in a lot of instances, I believe. So those are the things that sit with me. How about yourself?
I think you can be a brilliant leader in a broken system. And no matter how hard one might try, you can't fix that alone. It's a thankless and probably impossible challenge to be a hero to change the system by yourself. But what you can do is enroll other people and bring people on the journey. I think control the controllables is something that I would really like to reinforce. It's very easy to put so much energy on things outside of your control, but if you just really just focus on what you can impact, what you can influence, what you can change, and be really happy with that, then I think you can go a long way. I think the other thing about boundaries is the they shouldn't need to take energy. It's hard to implement, but once it's in place, it's just your system and people understand that. So I really recommend that people look at their own kind of work environments, life environments, and look at where their boundaries are bleeding and where they're opaque, and put the energy into kind of putting some boulders in place, some rocks in place that will help them take control back out of their back into their life. If you cede control to other people, you're going to lose kind of your agency around your life. So I think that's really important.
Has, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Phil.
A big thanks there to Has, and also again to Liz. And now to end with a small but heartfelt plea. If you found value in what we've talked about here, if you could hit the subscribe button, if you could leave us a rating or even a review, we'd be really grateful. We're trying to reach as many people as possible with this podcast so we can actually get some of these insights and some of these lessons out into the world. That's it for now. Look forward to seeing you again on the Phil Lewis podcast next month. Bye for now.